Hey there, freedom fighters! Before I make more videos where I debunk pro-Russian narratives, I want to make clear to my current and future viewers what I think about Russians, so that in the future my viewers weren't disappointed, I guess, in case if our positions differ or something like that. This is just an opinion of one Ukrainian guy, and different Ukrainians have different positions. It's not like we are this kind of hive mind and all are thinking the same way or something like that. So I'll describe my opinion, my position as clearly as I can, and you'll judge for yourself if you agree with me or not. So let's start with the question, who's to blame for this war? Putin or all Russians? Of course, that's a false dichotomy. I strongly disagree with the view that some Russian oppositionists hold that like 90% of responsibility is on Putin and most Russians are just helpless victims. Poor victims of the system. Yeah, even though so many of them want us dead or simply don't care about us being killed by their country. They just live their lives as if nothing is happening. So no, I cannot agree with that view. Unlike North Koreans, Russians still have access to the internet. If by this point some Russians don't know the truth, that's only because they didn't want to know it or didn't care. Different polls, different surveys show us like 70 to 75% support the war. They support the annexation, they think that starting the war was a good idea. Now this support might be dropping, but throughout these like almost 3 years, according to different polls, again, it was continuously high. Russian oppositionists don't like these polls, but I think there are better reasons to trust these results than not to trust. That might be a good topic for another video. Anyway, I can make this conditional claim that if that data is correct, it means that 70 to 75% of Russians are in fact Russian fascists, or at least their supporters. And that's a huge number. So no, I don't agree that only Putin is to blame for the war. But I also disagree with the statement that all Russians are to blame and that they are all equally guilty. All means 100%, and I cannot claim that all 100% of Russians are guilty. I'd say most Russians, but not all. A really high percentage, but still not 100%. I don't agree with the concept of collective guilt. I think that people are responsible for their own decisions, for their own actions or inaction. And inaction can also be really immoral. If you see some creature being horribly tortured and you don't do anything to stop it, that's also a moral choice. And that's why I don't need the concept of collective guilt in order to claim that even among that minority of Russians who do not support war, there are still a lot of people who are responsible for it to some degree because of their inaction, not because some collective guilt, but because of their personal inaction when action was both possible and necessary. I'm not saying about necessarily like sacrificing your life or something like that, but there were windows of opportunity that Russian society wasn't able to use simply because there were not enough Russians, not enough politically active Russians who oppose Russian fascism. Most were like pro-Russian fascism or didn't care. And that, of course, led to the current war. So basically I think that, yeah, first of all, Putin is to blame, then those 70-75% Russian fascists or their supporters or collaborators. Plus on top of those 70% there are also people who simply don't care about us being killed by their country. Plus on top of that there are Russians who are against the war, but they don't do anything to help us defend ourselves, or they didn't do anything to keep their country democratic. So as you can imagine, that's a really high percentage of Russians that I consider to be responsible for the war and totalitarianism in their country. That made the war possible. But as I said, still not all Russians. It seems to me there is a really small percentage of Russians who have done enough, some even more than enough, to combat Russian fascism. And of course I don't blame them for the war. I have no reason to blame them for the war. Some of them I respect and consider them our allies, but it seems to me that the percentage of such people is really small, and not even all Russian oppositionists are in this group. Let's talk about these different groups of Russians a bit later. Now let's talk a little bit about Russia itself. About the country as a geopolitical subject, geopolitical player. When it comes to Russia as a country, I want a total geopolitical defeat for that country. I want it to either cease to exist and split into smaller, independent countries, or just to be as miserable and as insignificant as possible. Maybe like North Korea, but with people allowed to leave and escape. So if Russia becomes this miserable place, but if people still can leave if they want, I'd be okay with that. At this point, I don't care if they have democracy or not. It's my personal vendetta. The defeat of Russia as a country. And also I think for humanity and the world it would be better if either Russia stops existing and forms new countries, or it becomes so weak and incapacitated that it becomes unable to attack anymore. I'm okay with both scenarios, although for humanistic reasons I prefer the first one, with forming new, smaller, independent countries. Yeah, in the beginning of the full-scale invasion I basically had a mindset of a typical Russian oppositionist. I was like, democracy for Russia, freedom for Navalny and Yashin, freedom for all those Russian fascists, freedom from Putin, freedom to Russia. But at this point I don't want anything good for Russia as a country. Democracy is good, and I don't want anything good for that country after what it did and still doing to us. Of course, having a democratic country as our neighbor is better for us than bordering a dictatorship. But if that totalitarian country is extremely weak and poor and unable to attack, for me that's better than a successful, influential democratic Russia that dominates in economy, science, culture and other areas, that has lots of resources and are able to really defeat us. Democracy by itself is not a panacea for a country starting aggressive wars. A strong democratic Russia of the future might still try to take more land or something else from us militarily. So we Ukrainians just need good security guarantees, like NATO membership or our own nuclear weapons. And whatever happens to Russia, that's their problem. If they want to be slaves to some stupid dictator, let them be slaves. I'd prefer that country to be weak because of their totalitarianism than to be a threat because of the power that democracy can give them. Of course, I'm pro getting rid of totalitarianism completely on our planet, but that's because I wish the best for humanity. But for now, I cannot wish that for Russia, unless that country becomes smaller, you know? I don't want Russia as a geopolitical player to just apologize and keep playing as if nothing happened. No, I want that player to lose completely or to be disqualified from the freaking game. Let's imagine some football or soccer competitions, like the World Cup. One of the team, let's call it Team Russia, brings weapons to the match and starts killing the members of the other team. They start slashing with machetes, start using baseball bats, chainsaws, even guns to kill or wound the players of Team Ukraine. Of course, any reasonable person would be for stopping that bloodshed, and not just for stopping, but for disqualification of that team from the competitions and even arresting them. But a lot of Russian oppositionists, in my analogy, in this hypothetical situation, they would be like people who came to watch the game and cheer for their team, for Team Russia, but then they saw that their team started killing instead of playing honestly. They of course started begging their team to stop killing, to lay down their weapons. Yes, just like me, in that scenario, they stand for stopping the violence. But unlike me, those oppositionists want their team to just apologize and continue playing as if nothing happened. Continue competing in the World Cup, maybe even winning it, despite them committing their crimes. And that's where we Ukrainians disagree a lot with the Russian opposition, especially Russian patriots. I don't want Russia, after the war ends, to just keep playing on our common geopolitical arena, but Russian patriots want that. So our values and goals are different, even if those patriots are opposing Putin. If you're a Russian patriot, I don't care if you're pro-democracy or pro-Putin, you're still my enemy. Because my goal is for Russia to lose, your goal is for Russia to win. Maybe you want it to win not militarily, but economically or scientifically or culturally, like in those civilization games. You're still my enemy because I want the opposite things for Russia. You're not like an enemy that deserves to be killed or something like that. No, you're more like an opponent to me. We might be temporary allies in stopping the war, yes, but we'll still be opponents later. Of course, there are Russian oppositionists who are not patriots of Russia, who don't care if Russia stops existing or becomes smaller. And with those people, we can actually get along pretty well. We can be even long-term allies. People like Michael Naki, Nevzorov, and so on, who wouldn't be against the disqualification of Team Russia, who wouldn't mind if Russia loses geopolitically as a country. In my opinion, such people can be our true allies, but Russian patriots like Ilya Yashin, Maxim Katz, Yulia Navalnaya, they are only our temporary allies. Although I can still respect them as people. I respect people who can challenge the system and fight for their freedom, but it doesn't mean that they are not my opponents anyway, geopolitically. Also, some Russian oppositionists say or do something stupid sometimes. I don't want to get too deep into that. I'm just saying that when it comes to the Russian opposition, as another group of Russians, it's kinda complicated. With some of them we can be temporary allies, but enemies afterwards. With some we can be long-term allies, and with some we cannot be allies at all. Not all Russian oppositionists are the same. For me, in order to consider some Russian oppositionists a true ally of Ukraine, that person gotta first not be a Russian patriot, second help our army. And there are not many Russian oppositionists who are helping the Ukrainian armed forces. There are some oppositionists who are wasting their own time and our time on trying to convince us that only Putin is to blame for the war. And Russians are his victims too. His first victims. Get the hell out of here. I mean, from the start of the full-scale invasion, I've been receiving lots of comments from my Russian subscribers who thought it's like their mission to defend their Russian tribe by trying to make us Ukrainians pity them. I call these people tribalistic pity farmers, a subclass of the Russian opposition that wants to get the victim status for most ordinary Russians. While we are getting killed here, they come to us, Ukrainians, and try to fix us, try to sometimes even demonize us, mark us as some kind of irrational Russophobes that are too psychologically damaged to be able to think rationally. They simply dismiss what we say about problems in their society and pretend that there are no problems. Russian society, Russian culture don't have problems. That's just Ukrainian dum-dums are being too traumatized and irrational. And we gotta fix those Ukrainians. Fix the way they think of our big Russian tribe. And as long as these tribalistic pity farmers keep trying to improve the external image of their tribe, they'll never be able to address real problems of their society that enabled Putin to take over their country. I don't know, I can't imagine myself doing something like that. Let's imagine my country, Ukraine, decides to invade Moldova, for example. I'll try to do everything I can to stop that war, and until my country is stopped, I won't be wasting my time on defense of Ukrainians. Because in that extremely unrealistic scenario, Ukrainians would be the invaders. I won't even think about bothering Moldovans and trying to fix them, trying to change their perspective on ordinary Ukrainians or something like that. Reading them lectures about being positive, loving and rational. Why the hell would I do that? That would not just be extremely patronizing, but also stupid and unproductive. If my nation is invading some smaller nation and I want the world not to hate my nation, my first course of action should be stopping my nation from being invaders, not to portray them as victims while the invasion is still ongoing. That would be a more effective strategy. If I care that much about my nation's image, it would be more rational for me to help my nation get rid of the invader status instead of trying to get the victim status while the invasion is still ongoing. But some Russian oppositionists don't understand that for some reason. They would rather play the victim card all day long than do something to stop their nations from genociding another nation. Sometimes these tribalistic pity farmers even try to claim that it'll be unfair if, after the war, Russians have to pay Ukraine reparations. Seriously. Now these guys really say that. Russians are also victims. Why do they and their kids have to pay for Putin's crimes? Russians were also robbed. They are the victims. Well, first of all, idiots, most of your quote-unquote innocent Russians are supporting the war anyway. Plus, it's the government that would be forced to pay, not every single individual. Of course, the government would take that from the taxpayers, but still it's not a direct payment by people, and it's important to understand that. Just like if you work for Google, for example, and that corporation gets sued and it has to pay some fines, it's not the same as punishing every single worker of that corporation. It has nothing to do with collective guilt of individual workers or punishing workers. It's about responsibility of organizations. An individual can always leave an organization or a country if that country isn't completely closed like North Korea. So the reparations for Russia is like a fine for a company. It has nothing to do with punishing individuals who work or live there. Even though lots of Russians kinda deserve some punishment for supporting the war, but still a reparation that's not punishment for individuals. From the game theory, we know that there's gotta be some tit-for-tat elements in an effective strategy, some kind of punishment for players who break the rules. If we allow countries as geopolitical players to do whatever they want without any consequences, they will keep being aggressive. So it is necessary to force aggressive countries to pay reparations to their victims. Plus, it's simply fair. And for individuals living in a country that pays reparations, it is still better than to live in a country at war. Without the system of reparations, without the punishment for your country, you'll be forced to pay more to your government if it decides to start another war. So even if I was absolutely egoistic, I'd still rather live in a country that pays reparations than in a country that starts wars and takes away even more of my money. War by itself costs a lot more than reparations. If you're a Russian oppositionist who doesn't understand that, you're not a very smart individual then. So we have already talked about the Russian fascists, Russia as a country, about the Russian opposition. Also, we've talked a little bit about ordinary Russians who also might bear some responsibility for the war because of their personal inaction. But I think we didn't talk enough about that. There's still a lot to discuss. Also, there's a problem of Russian imperialism, which is not the same as Russian fascism. So let's start the rest of my video with imperialism. When I say fascism, I mean militaristic totalitarianism. It's basically totalitarianism with all of its features, plus some additional features that I describe as militarism. It's this kind of cult of power through military or physical violence, something like that. Not all totalitarian ideologies have that militaristic element, but all fascistic ideologies do have it. That's why I think it's a pretty good short description of fascism as militaristic totalitarianism. But imperialism is a different thing. For example, Russian oppositionists who are against fascism, they might still be imperialists. They might be against totalitarianism, against militarism, but still they might be imperialistic as hell. For me, imperialism is a form of chauvinism and patriotism that seeks to dominate over smaller countries or nations, not necessarily militarily. This thing involves devaluing their culture or language, or in more extreme cases, attempting to assimilate or even eradicate those nations and cultures through political, economic, or cultural control. I'd say that all Russian fascists are imperialists, but not all Russian imperialists are fascists. There can definitely be pro-democratic imperialists who think that their country should be some kind of hegemon, or even that it would be nice to connect other countries to them. But not violently, no. Without wars, without killings, but just by being great. Being so great, being so rich, so successful, that people in other countries would want to join them. And I've heard that crap from all kinds of Russian oppositionists. All these guys feel so noble and moral when they say that. But come on, do you even hear yourself? In what other modern country it is not cringy to say that you want another nation to lose its independence and join yours? What the hell? And for many Russians it is an okay thing to say. They even think that that's something humanistic and good. Of course, that's way better than being a proponent of military invasions. But still, it's incredibly stupid. Why don't you instead just try to make people's lives in your country better? Just because it's a good thing to do, and not because you want to get more land without a fight. For those people, life is like the Civilization computer game series. Even if they don't want military or territorial domination, they might still want to dominate culturally, economically, scientifically, and with a high percentage of imperialists in their society, with pretty imperialistic culture, it's no wonder that there are also lots of people who are not fully imperialists, but they share some imperialistic memes, some ideas, some narratives, some stereotypes. Some people might believe some imperialistic pseudo-historical bullshit. Some might engage in the demonization of nationalists. Some might disrespect other cultures or languages, and so on. Even non-imperialists might share some imperialistic crap just because they live in that Russian infocultural ecosystem. Okay, so we've talked about Russian fascists, imperialists, oppositionists, and let's finally get back to simple Russian people. If they are neither oppositionists nor supporters of the Russian fascism, then they are probably de-politicized Russians, people who live in their own little worlds. They don't know much because they don't care. They have completely delegated politics to their leaders. Most of them are probably imperialists to some degree. But let's imagine a truly apolitical Russian who's not a patriot, not an imperialist. He just simply truly doesn't care about politics. In my opinion, that guy is also responsible for the war, because of his inaction. Of course, not everybody should be involved in politics 24/7. In a healthy country, there should be some healthy percentage of people who are more into politics, who follow closely what happens in politics, and won't let their politicians do some crazy shit, something they're not supposed to do. But the rest of population should sometimes temporarily increase their level of political participation, political involvement. For example, during elections, or if your country starts a freaking war. So even though there are people who do it professionally and more involved into politics, all the rest of population should still sometimes increase their political involvement. But most of Russians don't seem to understand that. Most of them are extremely depoliticized, and that enables their dictator to do whatever he wants. Because he knows that whatever he does, people will still go to work, produce stuff, fix stuff, pay taxes. The economy is definitely not gonna stop. And that's also because every little cog in that system keeps doing its job. I'll repeat again that I don't believe in collective guilt, only in personal responsibility. And every ruble you make for your dictator to fuel his war machine, that is your responsibility. That ruble is your contribution to the genocide of Ukrainians. And I have no need in the concept of collective guilt in order to tell you the fact that with every single ruble you make and give to your dictator, you are helping the war. That you probably have helped the war. That was your decision. Some people simply cannot physically leave that war machine, that country, but you can, and you still don't do it, and instead keep working, keep paying taxes. Then you are responsible for everything you produce, for every ruble you make, for every loaf of bread you bake, or whatever you're doing. You're like this production unit that keeps bringing some value into the system, like in Satisfactory or Factorio game. You're like this machine that's working, and don't tell me that you're not responsible for that war in that case. Of course, if you don't pay taxes, if you don't produce stuff for the system, if you don't put more money into the system, maybe you live in the forests and grow your own food, or maybe you are retired and take from the system more money than you put back into it. Of course, I don't blame you for not leaving Russia. We actually need people like you who would help to deplete the system from the inside. Go take as much money from your government as you can. If you're like a person with a disability or, as I said, retired, take every ruble out of the system, everything you can, and try not to return it back. People shouldn't forget that voting with their wallets, that's a form of democracy that most totalitarian regimes cannot take away from you, unless they are so communistic that there's no money at all in people's wallets. And we should exercise that form of voting. So vote with your wallet responsibly. So there are two things I've just talked about. Personal responsibility for at least temporary political activity, and personal responsibility for financing the country. It doesn't matter whether you want to have a dictator or not, whether you want your soldiers to kill Ukrainians or don't. It doesn't matter unless it affects your actions. Actions, that's what matters. What matters is what you did politically and economically. Have you even tried to affect politics without risking your life when it was possible to do so? And also, what's your economical impact on the genocide machine? Did you give more money to its creation or its destruction? For me, it doesn't matter what country you were born in, but the country in which you keep living and keep paying taxes. That tells me a lot about your morals. Well, that's it for now, guys. I hope I made my position clear enough. I believe in personal responsibility, and I think that most Russians are personally responsible for the war. And if they accept that responsibility for their decisions, they will be able to have a positive effect. If not, they'll keep being little cogs in Putin's war machine. So guys, subscribe, write in the comments what you think about this, and don't forget that totalitarianism sucks, democracy rules.